So, I'll introduce Tony. For those who don't know, he's an ex-BBC journalist, now runs a weekly podcast, not the CFM politics show. So tonight he's going to be talking about, Accelerationism and Satanic Armageddonism. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Okay, so I'd like you to give Tony a warm welcome and let's
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. I just say, to the consternation of this lady here, I deal in lies. But I say that in a way, completely fatuously, because I think I get annoyed by people that tell us about the truth. I actually get quite annoyed with the light paper for those people because it has a thing across the front of it saying the truth. And actually, a comedian, Chris Morris, I worked with many years ago in the 1990s in London, he would always say, I deal in lies. And actually, good comedians do that. What they do is they make things up that could happen. Maybe they haven't happened yet, but the idea, for example, Chris did a piece for the BBC, I think it was on a day-to-day programme, where he started off the programme, it was like Newsnight, and he had a guest, up on the screen, chatting to the guest, and he managed to persuade these two guests to have an argument with each other and actually one to declare war on the other country. And then, pre-prepared, they had a whole set with great big red words, war, written on the side. And so that the camera pans across, backs off, and what you've got is they were all prepared for having a war. They cut over to the war zone, and they have this guy who's getting bombed. And so this is Chris's idea of comedy and entertainment, is let's just experiment with the sorts of people we know are running our world and play with ideas. Now, that programme, The Day-to-Day, he went on to do something else called Brass Eye. And now I don't know what's happened to Chris Morris, but he was, for me, one of the greatest comedians. It's a real privilege to have worked with the guy. Just one anecdote from him was that the first week I worked on his programme on the radio, in Greater London Radio, he was messing with my head. He kept making stupid comments to me and trying to get me to agree to absurd ideas. And I just got fed. I just ignored him eventually. But the second week, when he started again, I just said to him, will you shut up? Yeah? You're talking total, whatever, swearing at him. And from that moment onwards, he came over, he put his arm around me, right, okay, we've got a real human being here. And that's how he dealt with people all the time, whether it was members of the public, managers in broadcasting, etc. He was brought up at a Jesuit school, actually, but his way of dealing with people was, until you get to the point where you're not fazed by his celebrity and his fame and his ability, he wasn't going to take you seriously, and he thought that he was going to just manipulate you, and that was his little game, and he became a great comedian doing that. So I wasn't intending to start with that, but I think it's so indicative of how we've lost satire. Chris was a great satirist. We've got hardly any real satire going on today in an age where just this last week we've seen, as you may have seen heard on the news today, the boss of the post office explaining how the current government told him not to pay the postmasters until the election time, to string the time out. Quite obviously that was the case. He was a whistleblower telling the public the government had been keeping a lid further on the post office scandal. And then, of course, he's bullied, he's harassed by Kerry Badenoff, or whoever the latest minister is that's trying to prove their spurs. The same thing that you may not have noticed last week was the head of the border agency blew the whistle on the fact that there were hundreds every month of people flying into London City Airport, international flights, who weren't having their passports checked, who were just walking straight into the city. Now, this could be criminals, nationals from countries like Russia, where people are not supposed to just be able to come to the UK without visas, etc. But he blew the whistle on that. What happened to him? The same day he was sacked. So what we've got a mafia government, we've got a criminal government, and anybody that dares to speak up against them is targeted, harassed, bullied, sacked, or whatever. And this is the tail end, obviously, of a conservative, 15 years of conservative government, pretty much now. So anyway, tonight, the idea is to talk about accelerationism. I just wonder if anyone, I did ask a few of you at the beginning, if you recognise this chap here, because he is the father of accelerationism. The reason, it's lovely to get asked to come and do a talk, but I asked to do the talk about accelerationism. To me, it's a new topic. This is why I became a journalist. I was interested in keeping the old grey matter going in my job. I didn't want to have a 9-to-5 job, which wasn't, and journalism is something different every day. Now, accelerationism was really something which I first read about probably 2 years ago, and then I heard that this guy was the father of accelerationism. So does anyone recognise him?
Bloke of Coldplay.
Sorry?
At least of Coldplay, I don't know.
Okay, so this was the weird thing. I'm interviewing David Livingstone for my weekly show on a Friday, and he's the author of a book, Transhumanism, the History of a Dangerous Idea. Also, his most recent book is called Ordo ab Chaos, which is Latin for Order from Chaos. So, anyway, this guy's name is Nick Land. Nick, and amazingly, I went to school with him in this school in Langley Park School in southeast London near West Wickham, and we were both in the same year. Both, he was known at school as Nazi Nick. This is in 1976, 5. I became friends with him, and you might well say, well, why are you friends with Nazi Nick, Tony? Well, the fact was, Nick had an education somewhere else. He knew more than any of the teachers in our grammar school, quite a lot more. And I found this fascinating. He knows about everything. Where's he had this other education? So anyway, he went on. Nick went on through his, where are we saying, the death trip. Now that's not an accidental thing he's put in there. Nick was always a very dark character, and I was just amazed in this interview with David Livingstone. I said to David, who's this guy Nick Land you're talking about? As he's talking about transhumanism and about accelerationism. And at the end of the interview, I said to him, this guy Nick Land, who is he? And I said, I know him. I went to school with him. And David said, no way, in his Canadian voice, no way. And so I've got this sort of peculiar connection. And in fact, in a way, this guy, he's helped with my education when I was probably in some of my most formative years, age 13, 14, 15. When he became 16, Nick had been a Nazi all that time. In fact, I remember sitting in physics lessons with him scrawling swastikas on the physics lab desks. Nick he went on to suddenly, over the summer holidays, when we started doing A-levels, went into the sixth form, the lower sixth, he came back after the summer holidays as a communist. So, anyway, Nick's a very interesting character. I certainly don't feel hatred for the guy because he's part of me. He educated me in things like psychology, in things like history, in things like war, this sort of thing. In fact, I brought a little prop along here because this is one of the games that Nick and I played when we were. I used to go round to his place on a Saturday. It's, if you can see that, I don't know if you can quite. Yeah, that's a good photo, isn't it? It's Sea Lion, Seelöhr, which is the German for sea lion, which was the German operation to invade Britain. This is a game designed in the United States by Simulation Publications that Nick and I played. I played the British, he played the Germans, and he won. So that's what we used to get up to at school. So after school, Nick went on to the death trip bit. Must have missed that out. Nick was very interested in hallucinogenic drugs. Obviously, at 16, 17-year-olds at school, there were quite a lot of chit-chat about drugs. And he then went on to become a philosophy professor at Warwick University after we left school. And he was booted out of there for feeding LSD to his philosophy students. He ran something called the CCRU, which I think stands for Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. which was incredibly successful. It brought in people who were developing the internet and computers from all over the world into Warwick University. So the university people saw him as a great guy. He's a Nietzschean philosopher, by the way. He was always into Nietzsche when I knew him. And in a way, I'd quite like to play you a Deep Purple album that he lent me when we were about 15, which I still like to listen to now. If you don't mind, we'll have just questions at the end.
Just want to ask who Jules Evans is.
I don't know, really. You'll find that article up online about Nick and about accelerationism. And he actually brings in this stuff about Aleister Crowley as well. So that's the sort of opening slide, and the opening for Nick. He's now living over in Shanghai in China, which is, for people that don't know, it's the financial capital of China. So that's where Nick has ended up. Okay, let's move on. So can someone manually move on, please? That little gizmo doesn't work. So what is accelerationism? As I mentioned briefly, Ordo ab chaos, order from chaos. And Nick was always very much into this sort of thing, is chaos. Creating chaos. I was just recounting earlier today, because I was doing this talk, chatting to the missus about this, and we were driving along, and someone walked out in front, quite close to the car, obviously in a hurry. And I remember Nick sitting next to me, and just after I passed my driving test, him saying, that's really annoying when people do that, walk out just in front of you when you're driving along. I do it all the time. That was the sort of mentality. He didn't see any contradiction between doing something really irritating, annoying, but that's something that he'd embraced. So anyway, Ordo ab chaos, this is a much bigger thing, which is what David Livingstone was writing about. This is the title of his latest book, which I'd thoroughly recommend. If you can find it, ordoabchaos.ca in Canada, is where he's done his whole history of the occult. And by the occult, really, what you're talking about here is Satanism. Ultimately, the suggestion is all these different aspects of acceleration are pushing towards what? What are they accelerating towards? Come on. Well, what they're trying to push towards is the end of the world. A massive war, a third world war, which will create such a massive cataclysm that they will then take over. So, order from chaos. So the more chaos, the more control they get. So these are cults we're talking about here. Satanic cults, I would suggest, at the top, at the centre, but other sorts of cults further down the food chain. And we have no idea who in our present government, who in our present media, who in our present judicial system, who in our present army are in these secret societies. We've got no idea. Because it's all secret, and in fact it's all legal. For a while, the House of Commons had a professional standards department which would look into whether someone was a Freemason or not, and it became an issue. Chris Mullin, a Labour MP, started pushing it, wrote a book about it. And this was, I think, in the 1990s. And the church did the same. But now it doesn't matter, it's all been forgotten about. You can be in a secret society and in a position of power. Apparently there's no contradiction. And so really, I think accelerationism is the official philosophical term, but I think the much better term is Armageddonism. It's about trying to get the biggest war the world has ever seen, and to blame that war on who? To blame it on... Well, Putin is a very interesting aspect to it all, right? Now, we could go into that maybe we really in questions. But the idea is to get the Muslims fighting with the Jews. But the thing is, these aren't real Jews, they're Zionists. So are they real Jews right now over in Tel Aviv running the show?
Israelis.
Yeah. But the idea is to make it look like a religious conflict, a bit like Northern Ireland. I lived over in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, And I can tell you, nobody there really thought it was a religious conflict. It was a conflict between the secular elite, which were largely the unionists, the loyalists, the more extreme unionists, and the nationalists and the republicans. So there were two different communities fighting for control, but it wasn't really a religious dispute. In fact, it was the Good Friday Agreement. It was the faith aspects that brought Northern Ireland to peace eventually. But it was framed as a religious conflict. Now, I think that's what they're trying to bring about, is a conflict which is framed, a Middle East conflict, framed as a religious conflict. So, again, your Ordo ab Chao. Did you manage to flick that forward? Shall I try again or not? Oh, here we go. And these are the sorts of cults, I think. This is a satanic symbol here, that are really at the top. So when you're seeing Freemasonry, when you're seeing other things, whether it's forms of witchcraft or whatever, these are kind of minor players, I think. Whereas these guys are at the top. So this is one of the most recent programmes. I did an interview with Vanessa Beeley last week over in Damascus, who's a fantastic freelance journalist. She calls herself an independent journalist. It sort of annoys me a bit that's the term they use. They're freelancers. You know, like me, I'm a freelance journalist. This is the way we term ourselves, not independent. I mean, anyone that calls themselves independent, again, it's a loaded term. And so what we've got here is an attempt to hijack the Jewish faith. First of all, by people like this guy, Jabotinsky, on the left-hand side there, who's part of the original Zionists. But he wasn't religious, he was a secular Jew. And yet he's putting forward all these ideas about what's going to happen in Israel. He was one of the founders of the Irgun, which was the Jewish terrorist group in the 1940s that were killing British soldiers and killing Arabs, and were part of the very first NABCA in 1948, which was the beginning of the struggle against the Palestinians, or of the freedom for the Palestinians. So, and on the right-hand side is this quasi-pseudo-religious group. So there's all sorts of groups like this around, and it was great to have Vanessa explain this for us on my programme last Friday. Now, for those of us a bit more enlightened, who like to see a bit of real art, is anyone familiar with these guys? Guy Debord, Society of the Spectacle. Now, I would say look it up. If you're interested in art, these were some of the greatest political artists we've ever had. They started in the 1960s in Paris, and what they were doing was articulating the protest movement in really the core of the protest movement in Europe in the 60s against the Vietnam War and against really what many of the population saw, particularly the French. They're always out on demos and that sort of thing. It's part of their blood. And so they produced these, do you see what I mean, here? I think it's a great little picture, all these people with the dark glasses and one person without them, you know, so everybody's kind of watching stuff. So what they were talking about really was an artistic movement around the idea of don't be a spectator, get on the field. And in fact, that's very much part of the French spirit, as we've been seeing, of course, over the last few weeks with the farmers. We've been seeing with the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests. And at this point, I'd like to just plug this book. This is another chap I interviewed. I don't know how easy this is to see. The book's called States of Emergency. Maybe you can see that there. States of Emergency, Keeping the Global Population in Check, by Kees van der Pijl. Now, he used to be at Sussex University, which Nick went to, by the way, when he was doing philosophy. And he was kicked out for some reason. I think he was removed. But he's one of the greatest analysts there is of what's going on in the world today. Kees van der Pijl, Dutch writer. He's actually a sociologist, I think. But this is all about keeping the global population in check. I'm in the middle of this at the moment. It's a brilliant, rip-roaring read. And it's almost unputdownable, because he's taking us through what's really going on. So whilst everyone's watching the TV, watching not out on the streets themselves, but watching these, things roll past, he's suggesting the most important thing to do is to actually get involved. And first of all, you've got to understand the forces at work. So what states of emergency is about is the fact that there is a fascist takeover going on in the West, particularly. It's already happened in China. I mean, if you speak out against President Xi, that's it. You're under arrest. You can't do that sort of thing. Obviously, we've seen the arrest of Julian Assange over here. This sort of thing, attempts to stop freedom of speech that way. But what he's saying is, as the fascist takeover kicks in, what I would suggest is a kind of Fourth Reich, kicks in a financial system which is taking over politics. It's buying up any opposition, whether it's in the press or anywhere else, in the courts. So the elites want to be one step ahead of the game by controlling any potential opposition, setting up, for example, fake opposition groups that people will join thinking they're joining the opposition, but actually it's secretly controlled by them. So states of emergency is all about that, and he actually does pick out a few movements in different parts of the world which he thinks are genuine uprisings against this attempt to crush people financially. I don't know if people have been following what's going on in India. The Indian farmers are all going to Delhi again, like they did about 4 years ago, because they're finding it impossible to make a living in India. And so it's a massive protest against the central government. Of course, we've got this thing called the cost of living crisis here, which is causing people to have to go to food banks, making it very difficult. In fact, I remember reporting on I think it was a Labour MP on one of the main news programmes, who said something I thought was fantastic to hear it, which is work is no longer a route out of poverty. Talking to some of the constituents who were trying to pay the rent, they were trying to pay the electricity bills, not on minimum wage, a bit above minimum wage, but finding it impossible to survive. Things like fuel bills, transport bills, rent, all these costs in this part of the world are far, far, far too high. It's called racketeering, profiteering, market fixing. And that's why China is doing so well, because we are having to pay a fortune, each of us in this country, just to stand still with all these people, what they call rentiers, renting everything out and jacking up the price of the things they're renting out, like houses, like whether it's electricity, that sort of thing. Okay, so I'll just stick to my make sure I'm trying at least to keep on schedule. So the accelerationism is it's very noticeable to me. The more I've looked into it, to see on lots of different issues that we're seeing in the press, you can see an accelerationist agenda at work. This is what David Icke used to call problem, reaction, solution, basically. But it's part of a philosophical movement which has come from Nick, basically, through people like Yuval Noah Harari, Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal. A lot of these people are also Bilderbergers. And you can see the same philosophy being thrown down to governments right across the West, particularly now. Sorry?
What is that?
Well, the philosophy is you create a crisis and then the solution to the crisis makes things worse. So let's think about the economic crisis. Apparently the solution to that, once they increased the fuel prices, the petrol companies did a couple of years ago, then they suddenly said, we're going to have to increase interest rates to... Oh, hang on, Bo, but interest rates actually will increase inflation, not decrease inflation. So there's an argument put out that the economic solution is going to make a difference in the right direction. Actually, what it does, it makes things worse. So it's just one example in the economy, how they have made things far worse by increasing interest. Of course it's going to make life more difficult. If people have got to pay more interest on their mortgages, on business loans, that means prices will have to go up even more. And so that's just one example. But let's have a look. Think about climate too. The solution to the climate crisis is what? Well, there's nothing. Well, there's first of all taxation, but also there is nothing happening really whatsoever in places like China. They're still building all these coal-fired power stations. It's not really making any difference at all. And one of the main things is they're building nuclear power stations. This is supposed to be a solution. Now, as an environmentalist for many years, who worked with George Monbiot back in the 1990s, nuclear is a bigger disaster. Look at what's happened with Hinkley. In fact, that design of reactors has already been shown to be flawed, but they're carrying on building it. And it's just a few weeks ago they announced it's going to cost another 15 billion to build the thing. So all these things are actually making things worse. In terms of climate, I don't really. I think there's an exaggeration of the problem. Of course, there's climate change going on. It is actually quite problematic. But what is the solution? It's not really doing anything about it. It's still just carrying on because the same pollution that's coming out over in China just goes around the world. We're told in Bristol we've got a clean air zone, but what happens is people have to drive further to get around the clean air zone. So that means more pollution. They have to get rid of their cars because they're not compliant. That means more pollution, another junked car, another car being bought, a new car being bought, and also the super rich with their Chelsea tractors, 50 grand Range Rovers, don't even pay it. Yeah. So this is not a solution. This is making things worse. COVID. Now, I mean, I've got no idea what people's views are and all that, but certainly the vaccine seemed to me to be just as problematic as the disease was in the first place. They could have helped a lot of people with a bit of cheap ivermectin, as they did in India. And so again, I think COVID is another example of the actual solution, or is it the cure being worse than the disease? In fact, obviously in COVID, that's much more appropriate. The migrant crisis, another one. Well, the Rwanda policy is a total and utter disaster, and it was from the word go. So this is not going to stop mass migration into Britain, if that's what you want to stop. This isn't going to succeed in doing it. It's not going to make any difference at all. And anyway, I think most of the migrant thing is about companies wanting cheap labour, powerful companies wanting cheap labour. Many of those people are genuine asylum seekers. Of course, they should have asylum, but there's also another agenda. So these are all, I think, another one. How about Ukraine? Another one. So you've got a conflict going on in the Donbass, in the southeast corner of Ukraine, and what's the solution? Send in loads and loads of money and arms to fuel the crisis. Now, Matthew Paris last week came back from Ukraine, a journalist, and he was saying, well, the youngsters are trying to get out of the country because they don't want to fight the Russians. They don't see the point. They want a peace agreement. And as anyone that watched the Putin interview with Tucker Carlson will know, and we knew before because we were reporting on it at the time, is Boris Johnson actually flew out there to stop the peace deal, which was being done in April, Easter 2022 in Istanbul. And when he was in Kiev, he basically promised the earth to Zelensky. He said, it's okay, we'll back you all the way. You don't need to sign the peace deal. And within a few days, Zelensky had been persuaded to sign a decree which made it a criminal offence to do any negotiations with the Russians. So that war has just carried on and on and on. So that was supposed to be the solution. It's just made things far worse. And we're now, I don't know the casualty figures in Ukraine. It's horrific what's been going on over there. Gaza. I mean, this latest so-called solution, I was listening on the news tonight. Biden coming out with some, oh yeah, it looks like there's going to be a peace agreement. No, Joe, there isn't going to be a proper ceasefire. So they're proffering these solutions which are actually not solutions at all. I can remember this in Northern Ireland with the various peace processes that went on there. And we was absolutely amazed, gobsmacked in the late 1990s to see Tony Blair and Mo Mowlam actually get a peace process through. Maybe they'd finished all the training that they wanted to do over there.
So, I know you don't want questions, but I'm kind of struggling with iterating a lot of problems. So you talk about acceleration. It's not clear to me how that is linked, or I asked what it is. You said it's problem, reaction, solution, and creating chaos. Is that what they say about themselves?
Well, what they're trying to do is to create chaos. Create chaos. So if you have a problem and the solution makes things worse, you've got more chaos. More what Nick would call entropy.
But who is they? And is this what they say they're trying to do?
Well, okay, so who is they? The deep state. You could call it the deep state. Well, obviously, the people who we see on our TV screens are not the people in charge. that there is a whole faction behind them, mostly financial faction, that's pushing these agendas. So I think that hopefully that answers the question. But accelerating a war, that's what they're actually aiming for. The chaos in politics and in the press, that's what it's allowing this war to become feasible and to potentially make it happen. Starting in the Middle East, I mean, if we look at what's going on now, you've got a massive tension building up with Gaza and all these Arab countries around looking at it, and you're thinking, well, why aren't they doing anything? Well, because they know that for example, the British warship that's sitting in the Red Sea is bait. As soon as one of these countries takes the warship out, it's a very easy thing to do, sink a warship. In fact, very easy. This will escalate things, and that's what the Israelis, the British and the Americans want. They actually want escalation.
It's not a term that these people use about themselves. This is a description of what they're doing.
I think it's a philosophy behind it, and it's used, I think, to influence and manipulate those in power. But some of those in power are literally, I mean, for example, with someone like Netanyahu, I mean, clearly he's supposed to be in prison. The guy is a fraudster. He's already been shown to be a fraudster over in Israel. His popularity is very low. The only way he seems he can stay out of jail is to carry on with this war mentality. And where does that end? I think that they're being backed by these big groups like NATO, etc., to do these things. So anyway, let's try and scroll. This here, and I've been talking a little bit about this idea of a Fourth Reich, because I did a book about this a couple of years ago, which I published during the lockdown, called The Traitors of Arnhem. And its subtitle is Martin Bormann and the Bilderberg Group. Now this here, and it shows you, I suppose, the mentality of the cult. This area here is, on the right here is Arnhem, I'm just about to see there. Down here is the periphery of where the British 1st Airborne Division controlled in this World War II battle, which we spectacularly lost. But the point here is this was called the Witch's Cauldron, the Hexenkessel by the Germans, because they were just smashing in with their tanks and everything. Well, we had paratroopers with very lightly armed. And it was 10 years after the battle that the first Bilderberg meeting took place within this, just about here somewhere, in this Bilderberg hotel. So this is their little in-joke. The Witch's Cauldron, where we killed all the Brits in World War II, is where we're starting this new series of Bilderberg meetings. And the reason that we had to lose the battle in World War II, and it was basically thrown, as I explained in the book, by the British commander, mainly by the British commander, who was, what was his name? General Browning. He was supposed to be running the whole thing, and he basically he ordered the American general who was involved a bit further back down the line, so down here somewhere in Nijmegen, before the troops were going to get here, he told him to go and fight in a different direction, and which meant that they never managed to get to Arnhem. Anyway, it's a whole story, but the point was to give the Nazis more time. This here, by the way, is the Rhine, so they were trying to cross the Rhine and they failed, but only because the British threw the battle. And this gave the Nazis more time to squirrel their wealth away and to prepare for a Fourth Reich after the war. So what happened with the money, as I explained in the book, about $1 billion that the Nazis had looted during World War II, that went over to Sullivan and Cromwell, the Dulles Brothers law firm, over in New York, and then it was sent down to Martin Bormann, who survived the war, was protected by the British intelligence services, particularly by a guy called Desmond Morton, who was Winston Churchill's private secretary. And he used that money, laundered it, and put it into 750 companies, which were the vanguard of this financial Reich after World War II, which had grown up and been protected by each other. It's this kind of massive secret cartel. So there's me with Marco from the We Are Change Netherlands outside the Bilderberg Hotel when I went over into the talk just before I published the book. back in, I think that was 2017. So, Borman's survival, I mean, this is the picture taken by Ladislas Virago. You'll find loads and loads of contention about whether this guy, who was Hitler's private secretary, survived the war. And there's a picture that Ladislas Virago took in 1972 in Buenos Aires. Someone looking rather, potentially the same guy. But anyway, there was another book as well, done by an American journalist, showing. Now, here's another I find fascinating. I think if we don't look at King Charles's history, we don't understand who's running this country. Charles, by the way, I don't know if people noticed back in November, a Remembrance Day service. Did anyone watch those sorts of things that they had on Remembrance Sunday on the 11th? Or I think it was the 11th this year. Charles marched away from the cenotaph, followed by Rishi Sunak, followed by David Cameron into the Foreign Office for lunch. The next morning, it was announced, surprise, Cameron is now Foreign Secretary. So this is how the country's now being run. It's like a kind of medieval king. When you're head of state in Britain, it's quite, if you want to intervene, if you want to be very much in charge, you can be. The Queen, Elizabeth II, we have to say now, I suppose, because of Camilla, she was very much hands-off, whereas Charles is totally the opposite. He wants to be in total control, very much hands-on. And so that's the sort of chap he is. As you can see, lots and lots of decorations in many, many ways. And I think this is how this nation is now operates, is through sycophancy and the way that people's pride is puffed up by being asked to join one of these great orders, Order of the Garter or the Knights of Malta or something like that. So many people are kind of... he's surrounded himself by people who would just doff the cap at every and any opportunity. This is one, I think, fascinating book by Tim Cohen, who I've interviewed a few times about Charles, for example, on his coronation. And what he's suggesting is that in this coat of arms here, you can see all of the evidence that you need to show that, whether it's Charles, I've no idea. This is what Tim is saying, that this dynasty will provide the Antichrist. And if you go back far enough, actually, through the British royal family, you come back to the Saxe-Coburg, that's the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, but it's the Saxe-Gotha family who financed Adam Weishaupt when he was kicked out of Ingolstadt University in the late 1700s, and there was this Illuminati scandal, went right across Europe. People may think the Illuminati is just a silly word, but it wasn't. It was most definitely a secret society cult in the late 1700s, which was exposed in Germany, and it was written about very well by a guy called John Robison, who wrote a book, Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All Religions and Governments. And so they're from the same family, our British royal family, as the German aristocrats that financed Weishaupt after he was removed from Ingolstadt University. So I think it's interesting following these bloodlines back. This again, I think very important book if you've not come across it already. Obviously I do a lot of reading, quite a lot. I haven't met it all the time I get, really. And this is about a guy called, I don't know if you recognise the outline there, but one of his close relatives died this week. Anyone? That's right, Jacob Rothschild died this week. Now, I'm not quite sure what exactly relationship Victor was to Jacob, but this is Victor Rothschild. He was a very powerful figure in World War II, in MI5, running security here, but he was also a spy, the fifth man. Remember the Cambridge spies? Anyone reel them off? Burgess, Maclean, Philby, Blunt, Rothschild. Absolutely. Roland Perry got a Jewish publisher. He's an Australian journalist. He's still alive. Fabulous guy, actually. And he showed that Victor Rothschild was feeding British secrets, including atomic secrets, to the Soviet Union right the way through World War II. And at the end of World War II, Stalin repaid him by voting for the creation of the State of Israel, because he wanted that. And Stalin said, well, you've helped so much. On the other side of the Atlantic, Nelson Rockefeller delivered the South American votes for the vote for the State of Israel. So the Rothschilds in Europe and the Rockefellers in the States guaranteed that that vote was going to pass in 1948 for the creation of the Israeli state. If you think about it, it was amazing, really, that the Soviet Union and Stalin voted for the creation of Israel, which was clearly a British-American project in the middle of the Middle East. Why would the Soviets think that was a good idea? They wanted influence down there, but they voted for it anyway because, as we the previous slide, Victor Rothschild. I mean, by the way, he was a big advisor to Margaret Thatcher, Victor. If we can go back one to Victor again. No, that's forward. Oh, that's even further forward. Other way. Yeah, he was an advisor to Harold Wilson, he was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, and the reason I always try and put this slide up there is because he was the guy that destroyed the BBC. In the 1980s under Thatcher, I think it was 1987, he went to the chairman of the BBC, Marmaduke Hussey, in 87, and said to him, can you sack the Director General? In fact, Hussey writes this in his biography. He said, Victor Rothschild came to me and said, can I sack the Director General? I said, I think so. And so Alistair Milne was sacked. And he was the last decent Director General we ever had at the BBC. And after that they had John Burt and a whole succession of zombies, really. And that job of Director General as the editorial chief of the corporation was absolutely key. And so Victor was responsible. By the way, Marmaduke Hussey's wife was the chief lady in waiting to the Queen. So this is the sort of small circle of people around the royal family that operates. So yeah, forward again, please. That's a terrific book, by the way. Absolutely amazing.
5 minutes.
Okay. 5?
No, you said 5.
5? 15 or 5? We've got to get through some of this. So that's just, I think, shows. Well, it's only an illustration, but there are tremendous similarities between witchcraft and Freemasonry. I think, really, in the English Civil War, obviously, it wasn't acceptable to have publicly open witchcraft going on. So they invented Freemasonry, which was if you look at the actual oaths, they're very, very similar between the two different cults. Next one. He was the... what did he found? Does anyone know, this guy? The British Empire. He wrote a document for Queen Elizabeth, which was all about how to build up an empire. And so that's why we had a British Empire. You know, I was thinking the other day, the Romans, we always, there's that Monty Python thing, isn't there, where they say, what did the Romans ever do for us? The reason there's so much hatred around the British these days, I think, is largely because it's within living memory. Our empire's within living memory, and it was brutal. So he's the guy that started it. This idea of massive sea power, all sorts of dirty tricks, but he laid the plan out for it all. John Dee. 007, I think they called him, as well. But anyway, fascinating guy, and devious, really devious. And when the kings of England started to go against this plan, say, no, we're not going to impoverish the whole country, have an industrial revolution, make everyone work in factories, kick them off the land, like King Charles I did. Oh, what happened to him? Shh. So the plan was there, and it was going to be rolled out. Whatever king tried to get in the way, he was swept out of the way. And then when they had the restoration of Charles II and James I, the Glorious Revolution, the evil empire took over again. So we had a little bit of respite after the Civil War with the restoration. Anyway, next. So we're coming up to date a little bit here. This year is the year of the dragon. China taking over, effectively. Now, does anyone recognise this guy? There's his name. What did he write? What's he famous for? Next one. He's a writer. He lived in Reigate, was born in Birmingham. But there's a quote by Sax Rohmer, that's the guy you just saw there, the author of the Fu Manchu books. And he wasn't just a boring old author of the Fu Manchu books, he was also in the Golden Dawn with Crowley here. And I rather like Sax Rohmer because I think he joined the Golden Dawn to find out loads of stuff which were about dodgy, devious things to write books and make money. And so the Fu Manchu novels they're flavoured with a lot of the ideas from the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn, as you can see if you read this little piece on the left here, is all about getting rid of the Abrahamic Western faiths, religions, and replacing them with the Eastern religions, you see. So the red dusk of the West will have fallen, the golden dawn of the East will come. So that's what actually the context of the Golden Dawn and Crowley. The renowned Satanist, self-confessed very much, and of course, next one, this guy wrote all about Crowley because he went to have lunch with him and things like that, Dennis Wheatley. So if you've got any of your old Dennis Wheatley novels, they are fantastic. I mean, Wheatley's one of the great writers, a brilliant historical novelist. He wrote a lot of great stuff about World War II with his Gregory Salas character. And, I mean, he's been kind of written out of history now, Wheatley. So dig out all those old Wheatley books. I think he was probably a Freemason. But, you know, obviously, he's trying to get information out to the public. He was, in fact, a deception planner in World War II in Whitehall. That means he was working with the War Cabinet on plans to, for example, fool the Nazis into thinking that the British were coming in D-Day were coming over Calais. And they did a fantastic job in completely conning the Nazis into do that. Wheatley was one of those. He would now be called a psychological warfare officer. That's what they call them now. But he was doing that in World War II. And in fact, there was something like 5 divisions kept by the Wehrmacht in Calais, waiting for the invasion that never came, which enabled the Americans and the British and the Canadians to get a foothold in Normandy on D-Day. Next. Okay. So this I dug out. I haven't seen anyone else that managed to get hold of this. In the early days of the internet, someone popped it up for a few days and then it disappeared, but I managed to keep a copy of it. Look at this. I mean, how blatant can you get? This is the insignia of MI5. MI5. But what's this doing here? These people are the permanent government. They're attached to the Home Office, and they are in charge.
They are in charge. Yeah.
That's what I believe in this country. We don't have any real democracy. You can go and chat to your MP. If it's anything really important, I'm afraid you're going to get nowhere with your MP, because these people are actually in charge of the policy, and they're working in conjunction with other cults in the intelligence world, the deep state, it's called.
They're part of the Five Eyes.
Well, Five Eyes is a good point. Thank you for these interventions, because it's not really Five Eyes at all. And anyway, so the Five Eyes, do people know what countries they represent? Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United States, Britain. Okay, so 2 down in Australasia and 2 over the other side of the Atlantic. But it's a load of rubbish. First of all, why would you call it Five Eyes? That would mean you only had 1 eye each, wouldn't it? It should be 10 eyes, shouldn't it? I mean, as far as I know, most people have got 2 eyes, not 1. So that's an interesting terminology. But actually, it's not 5 eyes. It's 6 eyes. Because one of the major components of the deep state is the Mossad, the Israelis. I was told that by Alex Thompson, who you might have come across, from ex-GCHQ guy. He said, we used to deal with the Mossad all the time, but they never ever mentioned this to the public. So it's not really 5 eyes at all, it's 6 eyes or 12 eyes. No, 6 eyes. Next. So this, I think, is fantastic. This just, for me, illustrates. And this is a thing called the Order of the Nine Angles. Now, this is a far-right satanic death cult. And there's been pressure in this country to get the Home Office to ban it. And you never hear about this, do you? You hear about Al-Qaeda, you'll hear about all sorts of other things, but you'll never hear about the Order of the Nine Angles. Actually, the BBC did a really good article about them during the lockdown. But they work on, I mean, there's I can't remember the guy's name, but there is a book about them too. But people just haven't heard of these cults. The O9A. Nick Land endorses the Order of the Nine Angles. He thinks they're great. They're helping with accelerationism. So in other words, they can be used to murder, assassinate, etc., in order to further the goals of the accelerationists.
Where are they based?
Well, look, you can. Apparently, they've got a Telegram group. I mean, I haven't ever really had a look, but it's a very real threat. The idea is that you progress up through this organisation by carrying out audacious murders, audacious assassinations. Why has this not been banned in this country? Next. Is that chaos? I'm not sure. Anyway, look, the reason really we're talking about acceleration, I'm just coming to the end now, I hope that I'm not going too long, is because of this thing called the Book of Revelation in the Bible, written by the Apostle John, who wrote obviously John's Gospel as well, over in the island of Patmos, just as he was a very old man. And this little chappie here is called Prochorus. I was very lucky when we were staying on Lipsos, a little island in the Greek, on holiday years ago. We took a day trip over to Patmos, and there is this very anti-NATO graffiti everywhere in Patmos. They've got this. They still, I think, understand the legacy of the Book of Revelation being written there, because John had been exiled by the Romans. He was causing too much trouble, starting these Christian groups in the 1st century AD. And he was, at the time, I'm not sure, he was very infirm anyway, but Prochorus was one of his little helpers who wrote down the Book of Revelation. And it was from a vision that John had seen. The interesting thing is about John is Jesus referred to him, or he was referred to as the one that Jesus loved. So he was his favourite. I don't know if Christians are supposed to have favourites, but John was one of the favourites, if not the favourite of Christ. He thought he understood Christ more than the others. And it's interesting that it then befell him to die an old man on Patmos rather than be killed, and also to leave us with this Book of Revelation. And that's really what the whole argument around accelerationism and Armageddonism is all about, because the bad guys see Satan in the Book of Revelation as the good guy who's fighting for real, absolute freedom against this annoying God who's always trying to put rules down in front of everybody. Next one. And as part of the Revelation cycle, as you run through it, I remember it's about 20 years ago I first started looking into Revelation, trying to pull it all apart and make sense of it from a journalistic point of view, really, saying, what's this about, what's that about? Are there parallels with other parts of the New Testament or Old Testament? Because Daniel, in the Old Testament, wrote a lot about this whole idea of the end of the world. And in a way, this is the triumph of good over evil. So, if you go back to Crowley and the Golden Dawn, the Eastern faiths and the people like the Greeks and the Romans, these polytheistic faiths, they say, well, it's a balance between good and evil. They have different gods. Some of them are evil, some of them good. You choose your god, and if you're a bit of a bad person, you have maybe a bad god, or you have a tough god. Actually, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are not about that at all. They're about good versus evil, right versus wrong, about law versus freedom to do anything you want. So that is to say within the Ten Commandments, I suppose. So the idea here is that this is going right through history. And someone at the back mentioned Putin, because the Russians represent a very different view to the West. They represent Orthodox Christianity, which, for example, has this thing called the oath crime. In Orthodox Christianity, if you swear an oath to an organisation, you will be thrown out of the church. If it's found out that you've done it, you'll have to confess the crime of swearing an oath, which is, of course, is what you have to do if you join a secret society, witchcraft, Satanism, Freemasonry. You have to confess that in the Orthodox Church. And so what we've had over the centuries is the Roman Church at war with the Constantinople, 1154, I think it was. The Great Schism, where Rome went to war with the Orthodox Church. And then we've got the Reformation, haven't we? Where suddenly the Roman Catholic Church is evil and the Protestants are taking over from them. So each time we're pushing the original faith further and further and further away. And within Catholicism and within Protestantism, these secret societies are accepted, and you can be within one of those and no questions will be asked, but not in the Orthodox Church. Michael Hudson, the economist, has also written, I think, a really good critique of the different ways of doing economics within the Orthodox world, and Russia particularly, and China, by the way, because they're following more the Russian model, and the Western model, which is finance capitalism. Over here, do people know what finance capitalism is? It's where money can go anywhere it wants. It can take over political parties. It can take over the press. What happened in Russia with Putin is when he took over, the oligarchs that were taking over everything in Russia, he said to them, you can do what you want here with your gangsterism, but don't come near the Kremlin. The Kremlin is in charge of this country. And so when they did, people like Berezovsky, not Kolomoisky, he was over in... can't remember the name. There's another one of these top oligarchs that got kicked out of Russia because they were trying to interfere in politics too much. And so it's actually the Kremlin that's in charge there. They're the chief gangsters, if you want, in Russia. But over here, anything goes. The finance people can take you over, in fact, maybe through a court case, destroy you. But that won't happen. It's much less likely anyway to happen in Russia. I think this has caused a massive problem. So the war that's coming in the Middle East, I think it's almost definite. It's going to explode over there. I mean, maybe I hope I'm wrong, but I'm just trying to be realistic about this. You've got the Arab world and the Zionists. When that kicks off, you've already got the Russians in Syria. You've already got the Americans in several countries there. So isn't that going to pull the Americans and the Russians into fighting? Once that all kicks off, the Chinese have said they are absolutely behind the Palestinians. So you could easily have a world war. So I think, trying to just look ahead, this is not prophetic, it's just common sense, educated guesswork. Look at China and the United States. With COVID, they were collaborating, weren't they? Are we supposed to think that China is really in competition with America? In Wuhan they weren't, were they? What were they doing there? They were working together. The Chinese use American satellites for their surveillance systems. But the Russians are another question. So the Russians are massively problematic because they're like a third force. They don't want a third force in the world, which is why I think we've seen so much Russophobia. So it's not just about the Orthodox Church being independent-minded and not wanting secret societies, in fact banning them. It's also about their political independence that comes from that understanding of history. So, let's just wind up by looking at Revelation again then, because that's what's going on in Accelerationism, is this battle for control of the book of Revelation. The idea really is that we would all read it, I think everyone in this room would read it as the good guys win, eventually, with a new heaven and a new earth coming down and the second coming of Christ. What the dark side do is they say, well, this is really, they are actually going to be beaten by us. We're going to have a far, far more powerful control of the world and control of these wars. And if and when Christ comes back, we will kick him out. So there's two different versions, the bad guys and the good guys. Who are really the good guys? Who are the bad guys? This is from Mike Peters, a sociology guy who's died now, unfortunately, but I got to know, he wrote a brilliant paper about the Bilderbergers, writing about Nick Land this is about 1996, cyber drivel, because he was coming out with all this stuff about the future of the internet, human 2.0, all this kind of thing. And so Mike was just taking the mickey out of him in this satirical magazine called Here and Now. Next one. And So you have post-humanism, the new consensus, the idea that humanity is just forget it, it's a load of rubbish, it's old-fashioned. Nick was trying to come up with this idea that to be human was something wrong with you. You need to be some kind of cyborg in order to be really cool, and that was his philosophy. Next. I mean, you could almost get a subscription to the Daily Express, couldn't you? Some of these headlines are amazing, really. But we kind of forget this, don't we? Do we forget?
Do we know where she is at the moment?
Sorry?
Do we know where she is, Kate, at the moment?
No.
She's disappeared, apparently.
Well,
They're all disappeared.
well, one thing I will tell you is there are a lot of them around here, aren't there? Highgrove, and I did this just complete aside. We went on a walk a few months ago up at a place called Caution. Around that area, there's this bunker, which was a regional seat of government in time of war. Everything's been forgotten about it, but it hasn't. Because when we went on our little walk, with a couple of friends of mine, squatters in Bristol, we came across a massive loads of developments been going on there. And everything's brand new. It's like millions of pounds been spent. So I'm thinking to myself, what is really going on at Caution? An underground bunker for nuclear war. But who lives nearby? So obviously, about a 20-minute drive away is Charles and Camilla at Highgrove. Then you've got Gatcombe. Who lives there? And Princess Anne. And who lives the closest to Caution? That's Camilla's pad. So they're all just around Caution. I think they're expecting something. Maybe they've made sure their bolt holes, all millions of pounds have been spent on it. But of course, it's all supposed to be secret. We're not supposed to know it's even there. Anyway, if you ever fancy a country walk, have a wander around Caution. You'll find all sorts of interesting. Like, for example, it was a Sunday. We were walking along, and this like small queue of 4x4 Range Rovers, brand new, all with blacked out windows, came round and into this so-called farm, which had automatic gates opening and closing again, and they went round. This is all smoke and mirrors in Caution. Next one. Again, Revelation. I've got a handout for everybody. I've got about 10 of them, so only take it if you really want it. But the idea here is to understand, in my own view, as a Quaker and a Christian, is that the book of Revelation has come to us miraculously to help us understand when things get really nasty. What they call the tribulation, the end of the world, comes. When this Third World War arrives, we will hopefully understand, okay, that's what's happening. And the four horsemen of the apocalypse are there in the book to explain to you, when you see these four things happen, you know what's going on, because it's all written in the book. So that's an orthodox icon from the book of Revelation, one of the scenes from it. Next. And here is one of the most recent interviews with Nick Land. So he's still doing interviews. I wouldn't necessarily recommend them because they're almost impossible. I mean, I hear his voice. It's the same voice he had when he was 14, 15 years old. But it's very difficult to understand what he's talking about. I mean, the latest one, this one here, Inducing Miracles, is really about, because he has this real dislike of any kind of organisations like trade unions, the churches. He calls it the cathedral, and he thinks this has to be destroyed in order for, the future, his future utopia to, where everything's run by computers, basically. I mean, that's essentially, he thinks that because humanity is making such a mess of everything, we just put computers in charge, everything will be fine. Well, exactly, yeah. So it's a confidence trick, but quite an audacious one. So he talks in this talk, which is one of the most recent ones he does, he talks about the way that it's impossible to change the future. Well, maybe he's right. Maybe he's right. It is impossible to change the future. Maybe this is inevitable. That human, I think I wrote it here earlier, didn't I? Man's pride will play itself out with the technology available. I mean, look at the technology that was available to the Nazis in the 1930s was the punch card machine, where they could get every single person in Nazi Germany. In fact, they started doing it with the countries they occupied on a punch card, so they could have their religion, all sorts of other details about them. They put it into the machine, and out would come all the cards of the people they needed to arrest. Now just think how far that has come now with the NSA, GCHQ, and all the databases they have and the information they have through all sorts of social media and everything about us. These databases are all stolen, they're robbed, they're for money, and the National Security Agency collects them all. So they have massive profiles on everybody now. So if you think what the Nazis achieved with the Gestapo in the 30s, I think that has every possibility of the same kind of thing happening now, but on a much more powerful level. It hasn't really happened, as far as I can see, too much, but it's certainly a potential we need to worry about. I think that's a real thing to be concerned about, not so much about things like climate, so much. These are real threats to our kids' future. Next. And I think this might be the last one, because I like to end with a little note of hope, in that this is a great little event, which takes place every year, and the one thing in English history which I was it was wonderful to come across after school in the 1990s was the Diggers. Has anyone heard of them? Do you want to just say a little bit about who they were? No? Oh, come on. Well, I just put a bit of water in here. Go on. Well, what they were was a radical movement in the English Civil War. They were basically squatters, like I was. I spent 4 years as a squatter in Bristol in the early noughties, and they took over land, saying, well, if the king's gone and the king owns all the land in the Civil War, now it's for the ordinary people. And of course, this is actually one of the most radical things you can say against the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab and the rest of them, who want people to own nothing and be happy. If you see with the farmer protests, what they're trying to do with this country and other countries right across the West is to bankrupt farmers, so that the land, if they're owner-occupiers, the land, and even if they're tenant farmers, the land can then be sold off to private equity firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, who will then manage agriculture on an industrial scale. And amazingly, people like Monbiot, who I used to work with, is encouraging this through saying, well, we've got to tax the farmers, whatever. Stop them using fertilisers. Well, look, just a minute. A 200-acre farm, I think it was John Seymour's book I was reading about farming. They had a 200-acre farm back in the 1950s he worked on, which had no inputs at all, right? No fertilisers, nothing, no diesel. It was just horse-powered, and it was powered by people who lived on the farm and worked on the farm. So the manure from the livestock and the horses would grow the crops, and the horses would plough. The horses would help in bringing all the crops in and everything. And they had no electricity, so there was no costs at all on that farm, and it was completely like part of its own little eco cycle. So that's the kind of farming we need, not industrial agriculture, not Klaus Schwab, and not George Monbiot.
No, not him.
Yeah. So the Diggers were really showing the way by saying, well, actually, everyone needs land. We've got about 55, 60 million acres of land in Britain. Everyone should have some. Why not? And when we were squatters, when I first got made homeless and became a squatter, it was almost like a liberation. Because you're out there looking around. I think if you were old and infirm, it wouldn't be much fun or disabled. But we weren't. And so you're kind of looking around, everywhere is yours. When you've been told you can't go anywhere, you suddenly find, right, well, there's an empty place. Let's move in there. No one's using that building. And suddenly, of course, we're in a world now where lots of businesses are going bankrupt, lots of developers are looking out, scoping for places to turn into luxury housing or just any old housing. And so in a way it was a kind of catharsis for me, finding myself homeless in Bristol in about 2002, and then getting in with a crowd of people who were squatting and got to know what is the law with squatting. And I managed to get a really lovely place because the housing association was in a bit of a mess for 2 years, and it just had new central heating, new windows put in, but no one was in there and it was empty, so we just moved in. Nowadays it's more difficult, the law. But anyway, the squatters, the original squatters, the good old diggers from the English Civil War, Gerald Winstanley, and he was a brilliant pamphleteer as well. He wrote, and if you know Leon Rosselson, the Diggers' song is well worth hearing. It's all about how in 1649 on St George's Hill, which is now a private gated estate, a ragged band they called the Diggers came to show the people's will. And the Diggers, I think for me, are sending a message to us today that all our school kids need to learn about, which is about how actually the land needs to be shared out. It is the only real resource we've got, and the idea that people are trying to fence it off is absolutely disgusting and terrible. So I've got the handout here, but I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming. That's it for me now, but I will take some questions in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Right, questions? Go on.
Yeah, you talked about Russia being...
Russia, yeah?
You talked about Russia being the third power,
Yeah, like a third force, yeah.
So what influence, if any, did the Bank for International Settlements have in Russia?
Well, the Russians paid off their debt to the West around about 5-6 years ago. That is all the debt that was built up by the Eastern European countries. Russia took it on. Bit by bit, they paid it off, they paid it off, they paid it off. So when Putin took over in 2000, it took him about 20 years to finally pay off those debts. The Bank for International Settlements, I don't think has really any influence over there at all. They probably have some delegate that goes from the Russian Central Bank to the BIS to spy on them, I would imagine. But the Russians are certainly not going to be pushed around by... And of course, we've seen the BIS, for people that don't know, this is the central bank in Basel in Switzerland, which is actually its own country, so not even the Swiss police are allowed into that particular part of Basel, where the BIS is. But they have the BRICS now, which is very much a countervailing force to the Western control through the BIS. And I did a presentation for the Green Party years ago about BIS, because at the Bretton Woods conference after World War II, I don't know if you know about this, but the orders were from that conference to shut the BIS down because it had been involved in funding the Nazi Party in the 1930s. Everyone agreed, right, the BIS has got to... They never shut it down. All they did is they moved it into a small office above a chocolate shop next to Basel train station. So it was an anonymous door. It didn't even have... It's like MI5. It didn't even have BIS on the door. But it still stayed there. And then it's become more powerful. And it's called... There's a very good book about it. I think it's Adam Lebor, who I think is a Hungarian journalist that lives in the UK, called The Tower of Basel, which is all about the control of money through the Bank for International Settlements. But there is it's a really good thing to bring up because there's a countervailing force now with BRICS against the IMF, the BIS. So yes, they have their secret meetings. Remember Mark Carney, who was our Bank of England governor, who I met at the Bilderberg conference earlier this year in the street. I said, "All right, Mark!" Shouted across and he just carried on like this. I said, "Don't you know your own name?" And he just sort of sloped on a bit further like this. So Mark Carney, he was the head of the regulations committee at the Bank for International Settlements before he was brought over to become governor of the Bank of England. So obviously these people are very dirty, very dirty. And I think they basically, it sounds like a funny thing to say, but sold their souls. They're interested in their career. They don't believe they will have any legacy. They don't believe in any kind of afterlife, anything like that. They just want to get as much as they can while they're here. And that's the danger with people like that, is that they will sell everyone else out for their own private benefits. Is that okay as an answer? Yeah? Anyone else? Yeah?
Yeah, you've spoken about the Book of Revelation. One of the central focus points of the Book of Revelation is 13:6, which talks about the beast's system and a mark.
Yes.
And the point of that being a control system where everybody will receive this mark and will not be able to buy or sell unless they have this mark. Do you have any thoughts on that, given...
Well, this is where news meets the book of Revelation, isn't it? Because this is happening. We've been slowly moved away from signing cheques to having bits of plastic that you then sign a little chitty when you're buying something. I remember when I used to buy petrol, I'd use my debit card or credit card, and they'd slide a little thing like this, and then you sign your name, and then you pay for your petrol like that. Then slowly but surely it's changed now. Then it's you type your PIN in. Now you don't type anything, you just go beep and you pay for it like that. Bit by bit we're moving towards the point where in your right hand you can have a little chip where you just pay for everything. They do. So what we're seeing, I think, and I'll dish some of these out if you want to have a look. But this is partly what I'm talking about here, because I did look at all this stuff quite early on. If, by the way, you want one of these and you haven't got it, you will find it on the Bilderberg.org website, although it's not quite as up to date as that one. The idea is just basically 4 pages that just takes you through this book of Revelation. It includes some of the major figures. So you've got this Antichrist, who's probably the most famous character in Revelation, who's a political leader. But he has a sidekick. Anyone know who the sidekick is?
No.
The false prophet. So it's a religious and a political leader together who are running things at this point. So the idea is that they come out as peacemakers. So when this massive world war kicks off, as I think it will do, I mean, let's hope and pray it doesn't, but you have to just be realistic, and you can see what's going on behind the scenes. China and the United States are going to be the main protagonists. The Middle East is in the sandwich. And as these things take place, these characters will be selling you the idea that they are the peacemakers, where actually they have been, through their secret society networks, creating the war in the first place. So whether King Charles, or, this is what Tim Cohen says, and he certainly makes a very good case for it. What he's saying is, for example, there is in Brazil, and the BBC have a picture of it on their website, on the BBC website, a picture of Charles, saviour of the world, with these wings that the Brazilians have made. Of course, this Brazil being the place in 1992 where they had the Rio Earth Summit, and a lot of this climate change stuff was started back then.
We see the technology almost in place, like with the Bluetooth mesh work.
With the what?
With Bluetooth. During COVID lockdowns, if I was on one side of the wall and you were on the other, our Bluetooth on our phones would say hello to each other.
Well, they can, but does that say that in Revelation too? I mean, the stuff about the mark of the beast, the interesting thing is the image of the beast, which is talked about in Revelation. And I think it's also called the abomination that causes desolation. Now, this image, to me, is of a kind of animated, like a kind of robot type. Or maybe this is something that's been genetically engineered, God knows. But this is definitely the accelerationist concept, is they believe they can genetically engineer humanity. And the way they would sell it to you, say you're a very rich person, is they'll say, well, if you pay us 5-6 billion, we will genetically engineer your wife's egg and sperm to live forever. This is the sort of methods that they're using. I mean, they're actually honestly talking about all this. This is part of the whole transhumanist agenda. So they're saying that these technologies will be developed, humans, they will be able to get rid of death themselves. Well, Christ and God says a different method of getting rid of death in heaven, right? In a different world, a new world. But they're saying, well, we can do this stuff, but we'll do it through gene editing software and this sort of thing. So this is what I mean about the revelations, where these two sides come together, competing, pulling to say, well, we are the ones who are the good guys, or the bad guys. But yeah, so the abomination that causes desolation apparently is going to be set up in a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And this is another zing point, if you want, in World War III is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is the third most holy shrine in Islam, which is on the same spot as the temple in Jerusalem, at least apparently it's the same spot, the Wailing Wall, where which some of the Jews, this is the Third Temple movement, want to recreate Solomon's temple. I mean, it's interesting how the Freemasons really revere Solomon, because if you read the Bible, the stuff about Solomon is pretty bad, actually. He goes over to the dark side. Yeah? So why are they revering this guy? And also, in the book of Revelation itself, it talks about that there will be no temple within the New Jerusalem, that just the light of truth and the light of God and the light of Christ will be all that's needed. You don't need a temple. In fact, if you go back to, I think it's the book of Samuel, Chronicles, it talks about God doesn't live in a temple, he lives in tents. The tabernacle is a tent. It's when the Jewish people were nomads, that's where you found God. And it actually does talk about one of the prophets in the book of Chronicles said, no, temple, God is not interested. He's interested, he dwells in tents. So, you know, who knows? I mean, it's actually Simon Fairley that pointed that out to me when I was chatting to him about this years and years ago. Now, you know, and he flicks through to Chronicles and he reads it out, you know. Tents, this is where you'll find God, not temples. So that's a bit of a Quakery, sort of Quakery view on it. Any more questions?
Yeah. I just wondered, you said about China and America being in league together, and yet they're going to fight each other. And then China's also in league with Russia, really, with the BRICS. I just wonder how that's going to work when they start.
Well, I know. It could be a bit awkward, couldn't it? I mean, I think there's a... Well, I don't... You see, the Russians... In my view, the Russians... Yes, it's very easy to see it as a big show. But the Russians, I think, are genuinely out of that of this link between... Yeah, I mean, how are they going to wing it to have a war between two sides that are actually linked at the top? I think it's basically this. It was a similar thing that actually happened in World War II. Yeah, so if you've ever read Alan Bullock's book, Hitler and Stalin, Parallel Lives, it's an amazing book. If you've never read it, Stalin and Hitler had incredibly similar sorts of upbringings, both psychopaths, basically, but they were set against each other, largely by the Brits. Actually, the British helped fund Hitler. We through Montague Norman, who was the governor of the Bank of England, took all the Czech money and gave it to Hitler. This is just before the wars broke out. But then also we were collaborating with the Nazis. When you think about Winston Churchill, he had to be kept off the TV in the late 1940s, or the radio, because he'd once said on a live broadcast, we need to nuke Moscow. And that couldn't be said. It wasn't allowed to be said. But you see, there was this collaboration between the Nazis and the Brits after the war, which then became the Cold War and the Americans. So my book, The Traitors of Arnhem, here, it really is, I think, shows a kind of new aspect of World War II, in that we all know about Operation Paperclip, where the Nazis went over to the United States. The Americans recruited loads of them for the CIA after the war, Werner von Braun and the rocket program, but people don't understand the close links that the Brits had with the Nazis while the war was still going on. That is to say, looking at all that loot, because I mean, you can imagine World War II was like a looting operation. The whole of Europe was looted by the Nazis. They took all the wealth from all the central banks, all the art treasures, everything of value, and then they just laundered it at the end of the war and after the war. Most of the money was kept in Swiss banks. And this guy, Martin Bormann, who I showed you earlier in Buenos Aires, as well as in his Nazi uniform, he was the signatory on the bank accounts, the Nazi bank accounts. And that's the only one person you need of the $1 billion is to get him over to Britain. I mean, it's a fascinating tale. The book is called Op JB, The Last Great Secret of the Second World War, how these British commandos go into Berlin with Ian Fleming, remember him, the James Bond guy, right at the end of the war, literally the last week of the war, and they get Bormann into one of their canoes, and they go out through the canals to Potsdam, and eventually they meet Bormann. Bormann meets up with Desmond Morton in the British sector, because they had to get them from under the noses of the Russians, which wasn't easy. If you imagine that, you've got a top Nazi in a canoe, and you're trying to go past the Russian lines. They had a woman with who spoke fluent Russian, and she was, supposedly in charge of it. So any problem they had with the Russians, she would shout at them. And Bormann was eventually brought into the British sector and then to London. Then they had a bit of a problem because Khrushchev was visiting London, and they didn't want him to find Bormann. But anyway, so I think the thing is, at the very top level, these wars are done for it's not really one side versus the other side. They're done for geopolitical reasons.
But Russia is a sort of separate third country.
Yeah.
They're sort of working with China.
Well, they are working with China, but if you think about it, the Russians worked with the West quite a lot, didn't they? After 1990, Yeltsin was a big friend to the West. Putin was doing a little dance with the World Economic Forum, wasn't he? Meanwhile, he's building up his amazing weapons program, these hypersonic nuclear weapons, right? Which he can now stand up to the Americans and say, right, I'm okay. If you want a war, let's have a war. He can stand up to the Americans now because they've developed, in that time he was being Mr. Friendly with the West, they've developed the ability to fight and win a war with the Americans, which is a pretty amazing, obviously loads of people will die and nobody wins a war, but so I mean that's just my view. I mean, you might have a different view. I honestly think that, if you watch that Tucker Carlson interview the other week with Putin, you get, I think, a great history lesson as to how we got where we are with Ukraine. And he did the right thing, I think, when it first started that war, and calling out the empire of lies. We are an empire of lies. Every day we see more lies on our TV. This whole business of, people remember last week we had a potential vote about a ceasefire in Gaza. The Scottish National Party had in their motion the phrase collective punishment of Gaza. Now that's a war crime. What if the British Parliament had voted on that motion and it had passed with Tories, Labour and SNP all voting for it? Well, the Israelis are suddenly being told by the British in their mother of parliaments that they're war criminals. We can't have that. So Lindsay Hoyle, Labour MP, Speaker of the House of Commons, said, we're not going to have that motion, we're going to have another motion. So that's why everyone was up in arms. And now we've got this smoke screen of, and by the way, I don't know if people noticed this, we had it on the show on Friday, what's his name, the Labour guy, Keir Starmer, admitted on the TV, he said, I was chatting with Isaac Herzog, the President of Israel, just before we drafted our motion, which destroyed the SNP motion. So what's he doing? Taking advice from the Israelis about what's going on in the British Parliament. Why is Starmer doing that? It's because they're all controlled by the Israel lobby.
Yeah. She's Zionist, basically.
Yeah. Questions? Any more questions?
Yeah, just adding to that, I had the fortunate pleasure with James to actually sit down with Andrew Bridgen when he came here.
Oh, yeah.
And he actually confirmed what...
Here's to Andrew Bridgen.
Yeah, he confirmed that the vast majority of politicians in it are compromised.
Yeah.
Absolutely compromised. So, going back to what you've been talking about before, we are run by a criminal cartel. If you look at history and going forward, somewhere in there, the UK, like Boris Johnson, what happened with Trump and everything, we seem to be in our necks in it. And it's,
well, the reason why is because we were the biggest empire the world has ever seen, which conked out after World War II. It's all within living memory, this. Not for all of us, but for the oldest amongst us, and for our parents' and our grandparents' generation, that's when the Brits ran the world. And we were in a very interesting stage. About 1900, Cecil Rhodes and Milner had decided, right, well, the British are controlling so much of the world, maybe we can take the whole thing over. And that's when it all started to go wrong. Because they set up, through Rhodes's will, they set up the Royal Institute for International Affairs. They also set up the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States with these private foreign policy think tanks. And so that's, I think, why it seems so evil, is because they were so arrogant to think, right, well, the British Empire is so big, we're going to use that and we're going to take over the whole world. Now, of course, it's, Ian Fleming puts it in, I think it was in Dr. No, where he says, world domination, same old dream. And that has been driving these people for many years. They just don't.
Just now work in the shadows.
Well, yes, and they're still going to try it, but they're going to lose. They're going to fail. They're basically banging their head against a brick wall now, mainly because of Russia being an independent third force and also incredibly powerful militarily. They're not doing anything in Ukraine. They're doing very, very little. As we can see by the difference between the civilian casualty rate in Ukraine and Gaza. It's completely like chalk and cheese. The Russians are just going, right, well, we're not allowing you close to our border, close enough to fire missiles into Russia. And also, we're taking the territory where all the Russian-speaking people are. All the Russians, we're having it. We're not messing around anymore. And so he's protected the Russian people. He's got massive support over in Russia. He will. We keep hearing, don't we, about, what's this guy who died last week? Navalny, the great opposition leader. He's nobody. He's not an opposition leader. He's a voice of the West. The real opposition, does anyone know what the real opposition is in Russia?
Communists.
Correct. Zyganov and the Communist Party are the main opposition in Russia. People either vote for United Russia or the Communists generally in Russia. So we're getting a complete lies in our press about people like Navalny, who, by the way, is very pally with our Bristol Mayor Marvin Rees, because they're both Yale World Fellows, tapped up to be future leaders by Yale University, which we didn't even talk about the Skull and Bones Society at Yale. But, these people are selected when they're teenagers to be the leaders that we have today. So whether it's Navalny or Marvin Rees. In fact, he went on Sky TV to talk about how great Navalny was. Well, Navalny called the Muslims cockroaches. He was really against any kind of migration into Russia. And he's also filmed at a neo-Nazi rally saying they should be scared of us. Should they be scared? Yes, they should. Yes, they should. He's basically a neo-Nazi, Navalny. Any more questions? Yep. Sorry, yes. All right.
In the coronation, when Prince Charles went behind the forged screens.
Oh yeah.
Do you think he was? Apparently that had been done under a canopy before, and this time, this coronation, it's behind screens. Do you think he was swearing some allegiance to
I think the dodgy oaths they swear are places like the Order of the Garter.
Yeah.
The Order of the Garter is the oldest in Europe of all of the orders of chivalry. We haven't even mentioned the Templars, right? Because what's going on with Israel is a modern version of the Crusades, right? But the Knights Templar, when they were extinguished back in 7, the famous Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th of October 1307 was when the Templars were arrested in France, and they were shown to be Satanists. And in fact, not all of these confessions were beaten out of people. Some of them came forward freely and said, look, we've been going through satanic rituals. There are several of them. And so when the Templars were extinguished, we had lodges for the Templars in this country. This is where lodges come from. Safe places, basically safe houses for the Templars, was what became lodges. And then, within a few decades, the Order of the Garter was started up. Right? The Order of the Garter now includes who? Oh God, a real rogues gallery. Basically, Tony Blair is now in the Order of the Garter. Of course, he should be in jail. And as is Camilla. Just look at the list of I think it's the Duke of Westminster, who's like the biggest landowner in the country. This is a real rogues gallery, and it's these places, I think, where the country's actually really run from.
But supposing that oath was done with 1 billion people, or whatever it was, watching, wouldn't that somehow, I don't know, it's just the level of deception, and I think all this has been, it all works.
Well, look, the level of deception, you're right. These people get a kick out of lying. And so, for example, does King Charles have cancer?
Well, exactly.
It does that.
I mean, where are they all disappearing?
Good question, isn't it? I mean, one thing's for sure is that a lot of people would be more sympathetic towards someone who has cancer. So is this just a cynical PR ploy? Or is it an attempt to market a new mRNA cancer injection of some sort? So when I hear that King has got cancer, and there's everyone getting on the BBC, oh God, it's terrible, King's got cancer. I just think, has he? Has he really? I'm not saying he hasn't, but I think we need some evidence. In fact, I interviewed David Halpin that week, the doctor who blew the whistle on the non-suicide of Dr. David Kelly, and he took us through the sorts of cancers that might be discovered in a prostate operation. So he said he may have rectal cancer, possibly, because that's the same part of the body where they were examining him for his prostate. Yeah, I mean, there is also a lot of questions about cancer diagnoses. I have 2 different acquaintances of mine who've been diagnosed with cancer, about to go through massive treatments, got second opinion and found out there's no cancer at all. So this pharmaceutical industry, I mean, they are absolutely brazen. There is no regulation at all, really, and it's all just a marketing. When you see a news bulletin about a new cure for cancer, this is an advert. It's not a news bulletin. It's a pharmaceutical industry advert, and there is no real, when I look at this stuff, there's no real proper checks and balances. So I haven't really answered your question. I have no idea what went on under the canopy with Charles. No idea at all. But all I can say is he killed his wife. He didn't personally do it, but Diana was murdered, assassinated, because of her support for the Palestinians, because of her hatred of landmines, campaigning against landmines, and because of her about to get married and being pregnant with a Muslim. And they didn't want to have a Muslim half-brother for Harry and William. I mean, what's happened with Harry is also quite interesting, isn't it? He's been spun out of the picture completely. Andrew, by the way, I've had it on pretty good authority, and if you look into it, he's almost certainly not Phillips, no. He's is it the Earl of Carnarvon or the Duke of Carnarvon who the Queen was seeing at the time. And Andrew apparently was the Queen's favourite. She rather liked Andrew. Andrew has been vilified, but what's he done? What's actually Andrew done? He slept with a 16 or 17-year-old prostitute. That whole Epstein business seems to me there's loads of people who are caught up in that, but Andrew has been hung out to dry because he's a potential threat to Charles. Go on.
Based on that, the judge in America that actually quashed the court case against Andrew is the same judge that has prosecuted Trump for that alleged rape of that woman 15 years ago. Could you mention that?
Well, I can. And isn't it interesting what's happened? Okay, you've opened up another little thought process there, which is Trump. What's happening? He's being prosecuted in the States, right? But what's happening is it's increasing his popularity.
Absolutely.
So why is the deep state continuing to prosecute him? Maybe this is a bit like Adolf Hitler. Do you remember Hitler he was a victim, wasn't he? A terrible victim. He'd been jailed after the beer hall putsch. And everyone saw him, it's terrible what they did to Adolf Hitler, isn't that dreadful? And that helped his cachet to take over Germany. So maybe Trump is another kind of Manchurian candidate, whether he knows it or not. He's the kind of guy they can press, if they want World War III, they'll press a few buttons on Trump, and Trump will deliver World War III for them, I would suggest. So much as I find Trump entertaining to listen to, it's like a stand-up comedian.
Yeah.
They could easily be manipulating this guy into that sort of position. And if you contrast it with what's happened in Pakistan with Imran Khan, he has just been completely swept away, stuck in jail by this basically like judicial assassination program, a judicial election fixing. And yet, who's supposed to be fixing the election? The Russians are fixing the elections, allegedly. in the States. You know, what an absolute load of cobblers. Let's be quite frank.
All the votes in the counting places or whatever belong to people living in this country?
I don't know. I mean, I think our paper elections are fairly fair, but the trouble is, very few decent candidates will get much of a chance. Mind you, this week we will most certainly see George Galloway. I mean, for me, people who've met George, he comes across as a very upfront kind of character. And maybe he's going to win in Rochdale on Thursday. And we'll see Galloway back in Parliament again. I'd love to see that.
Yeah.
Because he's been campaigning for the Palestinians since the 1980s, this guy.
And Julian Assange, he's a big...
Well, Julian, yeah. Yeah, he's a big campaigner for Julian too. Yeah, so, I mean, who knows what's going on. I mean, we had a big week last week with Julian, didn't we?
Yeah.
But, in a way, the people from WikiLeaks are continuing Julian's work, and nobody is being cowed by this cynical attempt. The only people that look stupid, it seems to me, are the British for doing exactly what the Americans want.
And the American prosecution are looking pretty stupid as well. I mean,
I did interview Christian Hrafnsson, I can't pronounce his Icelandic, the guy who's now the editor of WikiLeaks. He told me something fascinating about it. He said, I'm not so sure that all the reasons they're giving to prosecute Julian Assange are the real reasons. Because the one thing he really did, which annoyed a lot of people, was he revealed secret documents to do with bankers, which ended up with the Icelandic authorities prosecuting British bankers and other bankers. They ended up jailing bankers in Iceland. And that this really pissed off some of the very powerful people around the world.
yeah,
In some ways more than the Iraq war diaries. And I mean,
he's revealed so many things.
Yeah.
People focus on the Iraqi, like, collateral murder video and everything around that, but he's even the moon landing. He did a whole big thing.
Did he?
About how...
well, look, I mean, I don't buy any of that, I'm afraid. That far back, I don't think things were so controlled. 1960s, things were kind of much more normal. The journalism was more normal. If, these big conspiracies had been going on there, I think they would have been much more likely to be revealed. When it came to the 80s and 90s, journalism was shut down. Much of what we're seeing today is this kind of accelerationist they call the post-truth world. Another person I want to mention, I suppose, is Sandy Adams and all her work around this whole idea of zero trust. That's the world, by turning everything on its head, that is the world they're trying to bring in, which where nobody trusts anybody, nobody loves any stranger. Everyone is in fear of everybody else and what they might be about to do to them. And this is part of that accelerationist agenda, is to just break up any kind of natural friendship that we would have with people around us, and cohesion, and to drive us all in on ourselves, to be afraid. Nick was always into fear. He thought fear was the one most powerful weapon in the world is fear. And actually it's the devil's most powerful weapon, to make you afraid.
You've got your maths. One last question, Tony. What do you think, what's the worst will happen if Keir Starmer gets in? I mean, the guy that wanted everybody vaccinated.
What you're going to get, I think, with Starmer is a form of national socialism. I mean, a kind of British Nazi party. I'm not supporting the Tories. I'm more afraid of what Starmer represents. Because if you think about what he did when he was head of the Crown Prosecution Service, a whole list of hideous things. One was the prosecution of Julian Assange. Secondly was the exoneration of Jimmy Savile. So this guy, when he was in the Crown Prosecution Service, was one of their creatures, one of their animals, who would do whatever he's told. And of course he did exactly the same last Wednesday. He did what the Israelis wanted, which is he told the Speaker of the House of Commons, look, if you go against me, you won't be Speaker once we take over. And then, of course, he denied it. But that's what all the papers last Wednesday were saying. That's what's happened. He's been threatened.
He lies all the time as well.
Yeah.
He just changes the story.
And then he also was asked by Emily Maitlis from Newsnight, I don't know if you remember this last year at the World Economic Forum, what do you prefer, Westminster or the World Economic Forum? Oh, the World Economic Forum. Listen, this guy is just going to be a World Economic Forum stooge. So, and also within the Labour Party, it's very, very much more disciplined. So in other words, if you step out of line, you're out. They've got a horrendous selection process. They get the most awful, like Fangam Debonair, our MP in Bristol. I mean, these are hideous creatures. Most of them are just appalling. And they're snakes. But I'm not saying the Tory party are going to be much better. They're appalling, aren't they? I mean, so our politics has been completely sidelined. So that, by destroying, and this is one of the reasons I think the post office scandal is being so big, is people are looking at that and saying, well, politics is failing. So, time for another type of government, maybe authoritarian, fascism. Let's have that instead. Let's try that out. It can't be worse than this. So, I mean, maybe just a monarchical rule, you know. That's what they have in Saudi Arabia, our allies, you know, and Qatar from Al Jazeera. Anyway, I think that's... Is there any last question?
Can I just make a little...
Of course.
It's a bit different. I would like to invite you all to come on March the 19th, where we're going to have a lovely friendly meeting. We're going to have tables and we're going to look at the subject that Tony's just brought us and shine light on it and have a look inside ourselves and see, wow, can I do anything to change that? How do I feel about that? So we empower ourselves a bit. So this is going to take place here on the 19th, which is a Tuesday as well, and it's at 7 o'clock. So it'd be lovely to see everybody. And we hope, thank you for showing us how much work we've got to do.
Well, I would suggest people read this article, look it up and read it, because it includes this whole thing of LSD and hallucinogenic drugs. Imagine Nazi Nick at school, so he's then on LSD. My God, that's what we're dealing with today, is the...
But we can also empower ourselves. Sorry,
yes, I know.
I do want to say we can also empower ourselves.
But we have to understand what we're dealing with.
Yeah. Yes. Have you got anything you want to say?
Okay, so thanks ever so much for coming, people. Sorry it went on so long. Thank you.